Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. And you know what time it is. Time for Volume 4 of our movement discussion here with my good friends, Korey, Shawn, and Tyler. For anybody that's a new listener to this fourth time here, this is kind of just us guys getting together, rattling just ideas of movement, anything that we kind of been seeing with our athletes or discussions. It's a really organic conversation. We don't have really much of a script going into it. We just kind of see where it takes us. So I hope you guys enjoy. If you haven't, there's about, I think, 10 hours of previous discussions on the YouTube page on our previous podcast. So go check those out. But today what we're going to start with, for anybody that's been living behind a rock, Shawn and Tyler have been really kind of pushing this movement meetup, basically a monthly meeting that they do up there in the cities, but also they've come down here to my place in Dubuque, Iowa. They go on to Green Bay, I believe. So you guys have really been trying to spread the good word of movement, skill acquisition, motor learning. Now you're going on, close to a dozen of these movement meetups. Tyler and Shawn, talk about maybe some of the main discussion points that have come about from these movement meetups. Where are some of the thought processes funneling from coaches and practitioners that where are some of the questions they're seeking to be answered?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I appreciate you bringing it up too. We'd probably end up talking for about 8 to 10 hours if I try to recap all of them and even do it somewhat justice, because we have a tendency to end up staying, at least a good majority of people, for 5 to maybe close to 10 hours. So with that being said, I'll address, I guess, a couple of questions from last night, which will probably do a pretty good justice of what we often will discuss or ideas that we will discuss. We started out last night. Last night was going to be more a practical approach, which we end up spending a fair amount of time actually going over what we like to term, a lot of us anyway. And I myself have gotten, and I even, we talked about it in the live tweets that Shawn was doing last night, is getting away from the usage of the word drill, just simply because it's almost like you're trying to hammer that imprint on the brain of what you absolutely have to do, and you're not actually giving the performer an opportunity to find that emergent solution. And so utilizing problem activity, utilizing scenario situations, something that gives them an idea that this is not mandatory. So with that, we did more of a practical approach in the back part, which we can discuss a little bit. But the initial stages, we started it off with, you guys have any burning questions, anything you want to discuss? And the first one, which was which could have taken all night, quite frankly, was I hear you guys reference this Bernstein guy a lot. And last time I was up, it was the gentleman who had asked it from like 3 or 4 months back. Where is he from? Where did you guys get into him? And I was just like, oh boy, I feel like I have a relatively large library of stuff I could talk about from him. But then at Shawn, I was kind of like, almost, you're not allowed to talk. So because it might go for 10 hours. But the first question was Bernstein. So it was kind of like, what are some things he's known for? When we discussed repetition without repetition, we discussed degrees of freedom a little bit. We discussed a variety of different things. He has so many, or he had, he has them. He's no longer with us, obviously, but so many different quotes. No natural phenomenon can be understood until it's carefully considered until you can carefully consider how it emerged. And so, there are a variety of different ones, but that was kind of one of the ones we kind of started off with. Let's see what else came from there. From there, we had, I'm trying to think, the next actual question that came in may have been targeted towards stimulus. I think it was actually, do you guys use the word stimulus? Or maybe someone actually used the word stimulus and then somebody jumped in. I can't remember exactly how the interaction occurred, but I believe it was someone had used the word stimulus several times, and maybe myself or Shawn or somebody else in the room had said, information, and they were like, wait a second, are you saying the same thing? And I know I can speak for me personally, and I would love for those of you, because all of us on the podcast here have been at least one of the movement meetups, are they not the same thing? And at least for me, stimulus almost brings about I need to recall something from memory, and I need to be able to then, I've gotten that stimulus from the environment, and now I need to recall something from memory. So almost like it's a motor program, or another version or variation of an information processing. So I know for how I look at it, And this is clearly a lot of the literature from J.J. Gibson, from ecological psychology, and a handful of other people who have elaborated on his papers and his work. Is information is directly out there in the environment for us to perceive, which contains or has affordances or opportunities for actions or invitations to act. And so, at least for myself, if we have these actionable opportunities via the information or almost contained in the information within the environment, that is going to be something for us to directly act upon. And that's that specifying information that we need to have in sport. And we kind of went down the road, which we can discuss a little bit later, of why that information is so vital to our athletes and what they're able to use and do with that information, versus it being a stimulus and almost like a pause, and it's not operating online in real time. And I need to then recall that, oh, here we go. I've got it. Now I'm ready to go. So I know that was the second one. I don't know if you want to chime in, Shawn, anything or anybody else, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is completely spot on to where our conversation sort of merged and flowed from there. I think the biggest distinction that we have to make there between information and stimulus and cues is the idea of a stimulus or a cue essentially just takes the performer along for the ride through this processing approach or what's stored within the brain in an indirect perception type of fashion, meaning that the information that's out there in this stimulus or this cue is not the same type of direct information that we would perceive in direct perception type of philosophies or ideas. And in the direct perception idea, the information that exists within the task and within the environment is more than sufficient for us to be able to act on based on our interactions at that moment in time, or based on our our action capabilities as well. And there's a difference there, because the information idea sort of encompasses this deeper richness of that what exists within the problem. It starts to tell us more about the disposition of the problem. As opposed to a stimulus or a cue, there's more processing that's needed within the brain in that theory in order to determine what that information in that stimulus or that cue means to us. And I think sometimes there's some confusion here in regards to the verbiage, because we can kind of go around in circle and people use them interchangeably. I even tweeted about this last night, saying that I formerly used to use the two often interchangeably. Maybe I did, Korey and Michael, when we go back to our first or second podcast that we did as a group. And I've started to shy away from that because I realized that the two are not the same. A stimulus or a cue would mean not only does more processing need to take place, but also it's not going to allow for emergent creativity based on who the performer is and what their action capabilities are. As opposed to the information, like you said, Tyler, it has those affordances, and those affordances mean that the performer themselves connects to the information that exists within the problem and the distinct, peculiar problem as it stands there. That means I will get a chance to act with that information and interact with that information differently than each other person. As opposed to a stimulus says, like, I'm going to have this stimulus, and then I'm going to think and process, and then I'm going to respond. And we all sort of respond to the same thing, like the if, then that type of idea, that we see in generalized motor program or schema theory. So I know our conversation last night sort of took hold in that way, and that kind of was what I was thinking about as you were speaking there as well, Tyler.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that for sure, because that's is a great kind of overview and sharpened up a couple of the points that I was making for sure. I know that wasn't even a question I quite frankly expected to hear, which I'm happy it did, just because we went down that path and I felt like it clarified a lot of information. And we kind of already covered the next question that was asked, which was what are affordances? And I appreciate the guy who asked it, because he was new to our group, very, very intellectual, very good understanding of his sport. He works with baseball. And so we clarified that, like I just touched on, opportunities for action or invitations to act, or something we can interact with. And those are interwoven with that information, and so they're not separate and completely different things. And so with that direct information that's available in the environment, we can actualize our affordances. And so we kind of took it from there. And so I think there were a couple other things were mentioned, but then we got up. It was hosted at Concordia St. Paul. Friend Rich White, actually, where the Sport Movement Skill Conference 2019 will be hosted May 16th through the 18th. And so we went out on their turfed area there. They have a good amount of space. And maybe I should have warmed up first. One of the first things we did, we had Rich taking off sprinting, and he kind of like grabbed a little bit. No, he was good.
I was worried for both of you, actually. I made
a
few wise, snide comments.
Hey, Tyler, before you kind of head to the next topic, I just kind of want to sit a little bit more with stimulus versus information.
Yeah, for sure.
So would it be correct to say, or in general, that a stimulus is going to be something more general than information? Information is going to be something that's more representative to whatever task we're going for or whatever sport we're trying to improve the performance of. Thinking about like constructing a scenario or an activity,
mm-hmm.
The word information, just based off of listening to you guys talk and some of the notes I jotted down, if you think in terms of information versus stimulus, you're naturally going to create a more representative environment for whatever scenario you want to
mm-hmm.
create.
Mm-hmm.
Stimulus, it could be really anything, right? And I think that's a lot of people's first foray into these ideas, with maybe some of even the differences between change of direction and agility, because agility has that word in there, the definition, that's stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us, how I was, the first like, my world changed when I was just like using colored cones and all these other stimuli for my athletes to react off of. But it was
mm-hmm.
definitely just exactly like, Shawn, I love your if that then do this type statement, because it was, if I say red, then run to red. If I say 5, you go, right? It's still kind of, you are still there's still a high element of telling them what to do before
providing an opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not, here is you're still kind of giving them the answer, right? Versus letting them get to the answer with however they want to solve the problem, right? The answer is still somewhat given to them before they have to act. Whereas if it's, all right, here's something where here's the information that's going to be given to you, how you solve that problem is still going to be up to you as the performer. So information tends to be a lot more specific or representative in a mindset perspective, where stimulus is going to be a little bit more on the side of a general sense. Would that be, what do you guys think about that?
I actually really appreciate the kind of the comparison there between like a change of direction and agility. And I kind of can see where you're going with the thought process. I know I can speak for myself and say that a cue is associated with indirect perception. And so there's a need for processing there. Whereas information, there's no need for processing because it's directly available in the environment to interact with. And so kind of your example of like red cone, you're telling them what to do, and they've got a stimulus in the that's a stimulus that you were kind of referring to, versus providing an opportunity for them to interact. And that's a huge word there, interact with the information. And as far as the I'm trying to think, there's another piece you mentioned there. I just know that the cue part, it's almost like going and searching for something. I've got to go and search for it versus it being right there available for me. And the specifying part is what is going to attach you to what your action capabilities are, or what they can, or maybe even should be in that scenario to solve that problem. So for how I view it, I certainly view them as different, because they fall and are underpinned by different views of perception. And so, but I do appreciate the kind of the relationship example you were giving between like a change of direction versus agility, because they're clearly, they're clearly separate.
And I would just add there that the way that I view it in regards to the information, and I'm super addicted into studying the information that's present within the respective problem, because I think it gives us so much deep, meaningful information to interact with. This disposition of the problem, that only way that we can really truly determine how I personally can interact with that problem is through the information transactions that exist between me and that problem. When it's a cue or a stimulus, we all almost then respond the same way. As opposed to if there's an opening or an invitation, because it's information and it's deep and meaningful, that means it contains those affordances. And affordances then can capture a few things. They're frame dependent, so it depends on who you are at that moment in time, what your fatigue level is, how I handle fatigue, how I handle anxiety, how I'm typically accustomed to behaving in these respective situations. And all of that is different performer to performer. So not only is it frame dependent, but it's individual or animal dependent and specific. And then it also starts to bring in that coupling of perception and action so much more, because it requires that interaction that Tyler keeps talking about. This information exchange, we're all going to exchange information differently. So, Korey, it isn't so much to me that one is specific and one is general. It's in the way that we interact with it that almost makes a distinction. The information or the affordances only are going to be channels, potential channels or opportunities or potential invitations for me. It's not going to dictate how I move. It's not going to control how I move, but instead it's going to channel or guide it. As opposed to a stimuli or a cue means that I have to go back, process it based on either memory or a number of different information processing, generalized motor program or schema type ideas, and then determine how I should act or how I should respond. And so I think, it's great to work through these concepts, because we're kind of peeling back the layers to really determine, like, is the verbiage, are they just semantics? Or is there really worth there? And I believe there is worth there that we have to keep kind of like poking and prodding and to really try to understand the difference, because they're really describing the ideas of two different processes in regards to how motor behavior is controlled in sport.
So does a stimuli or a cue not present information?
For me, I think it presents information, but it's a different level of depth. Again, that if then that type of rule, or if this then that type of rule, like Korey's example, like green cone, orange cone, or this flashing light or that flashing light or whatever it might be, is totally different in regards to its interaction. It's telling us what to do. In most things within sport, in regards to organic environments, chaotic environments, and complex environments in sport, or just even in life as a whole, that complexity that we interact with has numerous interacting component parts. That's the definition of complex, right? Complexity within systems, two systems interacting with each other, a solver or a performer in an environment, in the task that environment contains. This information transaction to me is totally different. So even though there's a stimuli or there is information in the stimuli, it's more dictational as opposed to an opportunity or an invitation, at least in the way that I kind of think about it.
And to that, and there was some carryover there, I guess, a little bit, Korey, from the way that you had presented it, general versus more specific. But I like Shawn's alluding to, kind of being very clear with the fact that there's not just semantics there on words. It's more they're clearly different and underpinned by different theories and different beliefs. For me, what helps with me is like the practical examples. So I'll give you one exactly from last night and utilize this stimuli versus information is, we weren't actually using the cone. So the part that was from last night's actually the second part that I'll describe, but a stimuli would be we're going to all go and we're going to touch this red cone or touch this orange cone, like you were alluding to. And then the information that the athlete would be interacting with, or athletes would be interacting with, is last night I was the role of the defensive back in a situation, and the information that I was hoping for the athletes, or it was actually the other attendee in this situation to interact with was this athlete was going into the tightly coupled perception and action of the comeback route and interacting with information of what they heard, what they overall felt the environment behave like, what they saw, and then opportunities for action out of that situation, which gives them the freedom to make a choice. And that's the crucial part for me. And that's really where it lives for me, is the freedom to make that choice. And that's, to me, where that information is versus the stimuli, which is they have to. And so, that freedom to make a choice, we can certainly manipulate the constraints to potentially nudge or channel or guide different choices to be made based off what type of affordances we would like to see through our interaction with our athletes. We'd like to see them potentially explore or exploit. So that's kind of my idea. Yeah.
And the control space there, because as you sort of keep insinuating in regards to the difference in control processes that will emerge there, that to me is when we really think of, like, when we talk about information, it comes down to that information movement coupling, or the self-organization of the respective processes that create this movement solution, this functional, adaptive movement solution. It's matched to the problem that we find at that moment in time, but it's also, again, individual specific. It gives us an opportunity or a channel. It guides the emergent movement solution, as opposed to tells us how to perform. And so in that information-based approach, again, not to be confused with information processing approaches, which I think that's where some of the semantics or the verbiage gives people confusion as well, because you hear some of us talking about how, we have information movement coupling, but then a different school of thought or a different camp is talking about information processing. They're two totally different ideas in regards to the way that motor behavior emerges, as well as in how motor skill acquisition should occur or emerge over time. And I think that, to me, when we talk about information, we think about that coupling between information and the movement of the respective performer. We see authenticity, but most of all, we see this self-organization of these processes coalescing, interacting, intertwining, and integrating between perception, intention, and action, but it's all together at all times. They cannot be separated from one another. As opposed to in the cue or stimulus or indirect perception type ideas, again, these almost wholeheartedly keep something near and dear to their hearts in regards to generalized motor program or schema theories. They still have a human movement system that perceives, intends, and acts, but they're completely separate processes, essentially. You perceive, then you intend, then you act, or you recognize that stimuli, and then you respond. But it's not intertwined in the same way. They can be decoupled. And therein lies a rub for the practical application side, because as our friend Rob Gray always says, you have to keep them coupled, right? Like that's Rob's thing in regards to perception, action. The difference there is you could train the two totally different ways, two totally different ways, right? If they can be decoupled, that means we could train perception independent or isolated from action. Obviously, that's not what I believe. I believe that they must interact with each other. The human movement system and the self-organization process has to be intertwined and integrated at all times and coupled to that information and the affordances that they're interacting with. As opposed to, again, that cue or stimulus approach would say that we can do, like the vision boards, we can do, the goofy thing where we put things over our eyes and glasses and all the little visual perception types of activities. That is visual perception independent of action. And to me, as we've talked about numerous times on these podcast interviews before, there's just truly less efficacy with that. Not only does the information tell us that in regards to science, but just instinctually, I just can't buy that we can decouple them that much and think that we're making the human movement system a more adaptive system to that what they're going to face when they actually have to interact with that rich information in more chaotic, more complex environments.
Love it. And I think the interacting part, kind of to keep going, I think we're taking a large amount of time discussing kind of what happened and what we talked about. And did at the movement meetup. But at the same time, I guess there's a lot of meat there for it. When you look at these activities and you look at these problems that can be created and they're available for your athletes, it doesn't always mean that it has to be extremely representative of what their sport is going to be. Certainly that's going to be very, very beneficial. As you lead up to season, it's going to be beneficial. So that way they start to become heightened in their sensitivity to that information. That way they're attuned and they have that higher level of attunement to the information. But I bring that up only because you can scale that back to something such as mirroring, whether it's forward facing, whether it's going to be both, facing the same direction, whether it's one facing one way, the other is facing towards them and they're moving in a lateral manner. And even maybe it's lateral mirroring. And even some of those scenarios could be argued, depending on sport, depending on the interactions that happen, that it could be representative. But for other sports, it might not be. So if you're in situations where you have multiple athletes in a group, that's a way to keep that perception and action coupled with the intention that's there as well. However, there's information present in that because there's choice present. There is an opportunity present. There's a problem to solve, and so for me, I guess it's like understanding that it doesn't have to be sport and that's the only way. And you hear people talk about that. And that kind of is to me is a signal of there may not be a true understanding of what we're actually discussing. And I believe strongly, and I feel that there's a lot of other people, there's a lot of literature, a lot of it out there that talks about how, you can have scaled ways in which, and I'm not talking about a linear approach scale, I'm talking about variations of how you can create these movement activities, and you can have that information present that is going to be varying level of complexity. So that was another thing we talked about last night. We showcased that. And we were able to use a situation where there was great contributions from different sports and from different people of ways to educate attention towards certain things. One of the examples was base stealing, and it was how do I have the base runner pay more attention to whether the catcher caught the ball, whether they're throwing it down, whether the ball was was a pass ball, whatever it may be, and it was having the base runner pick up a number that essentially someone in the catching position may be putting up. And while that's not the exact same thing that is going to occur in sport, we all know it varies anyway, it at least educates the attention for that base runner to pick up whether that person is going to be capable of making the play to throw them out at second base. So that was kind of an overview. We stayed there till around 11ish or so, and then may have hung around for another 3.5 hours afterwards. And so those are always great meetups. I highly encourage any of the listeners, as we've always done before, to certainly try your best to host one in your area. I think you'll be amazed of the amount of people that are willing to lock arms and really actually have organic conversation like this podcast, and it's just an awesome thing. So that was kind of an overview from last night, a 40-minute overview.
I mean, I think that still hit on a lot of stuff we wanted to talk about, right? Like, especially the information action versus, general perception action or stimulus versus information. I guess I'm still very interested in, Tyler, like how did you start your session? Like, where did you start? And I guess you kind of already hit at where you somewhat ended up in the middle, but I mean, did you start with something like mirroring and that was kind of your base level activity, or how did you start and then where did you go from there, and how did you add in complexity?
As far as the movement meetup last night and kind of how we kicked that off, it was simply what that was I won't, I say I shouldn't take away the fact that Shawn, actually this was his main idea, so let's be real honest, it's him and I both together. Here I am taking all the ownership of it here, and that's not what I'm about, not what I'm meaning. So with that being said, whenever we had discussed kind of how we wanted this to happen, and we actually had talked about it with Rich as well, it was getting as many people to think, and to want to contribute. And that's really what it's about. It's not about just coming and being spoken to and taught to. It's about having an interaction. And I keep using that word, but let's be honest, that's what it's about. And so for us, it was giving people opportunities to showcase things that have been good and have worked really well for them, And so it wasn't any particular place like we're going to start on the left side and move to the right. We're going to become less representative and more representative. And we had people just kind of start, I've got one here, you know, and they were volunteering, and some of them were more complex with more layers, more information, where there's more affordances there. And then there were some that it was less complex, and less complex doesn't necessarily mean 1v1, because that can be highly complex depending on your control parameters, such as speed and, you know, and speed with direction. But we didn't start at a particular place, Korey.
Okay.
We started actually representative, and then I think we may have actually even worked backwards into less representation depending on the sport you were working with, and then kind of opened it up to what do we find are problems, or are all sports the same? Even non-linear sports in nature. You know, examples might be baseball versus soccer, or you know, baseball versus football, and how they differ, and how that might be more challenging depending on position. So.
Well, and that's probably one of the most frequent questions that I've heard repeated at all of these movement meetups is in groups, Michael, much like what you have to operate in, where you may have athletes from 3, 4, 5 sports, 5 different sports and different levels of mastery. How do you go about designing perception, action, coupling activities that may not violate, or hopefully don't violate, certain representative learning or representative task type rules that we're talking about here, or violate that information movement coupling? I think that might be one of the most frequent questions that I hear, and that was one that was explored a lot last night, and I was super proud, and I was just standing off to the side. I was just super proud of where the conversation went, mostly because it gave me a lot of things to be able to tweet, but on the same token or note, like just hearing the way that people were talking about it and actually thinking about it as to how representative is representative enough. I mean, that's an answer that I don't think any of us really have been able to come to yet. But people were having really nuanced dialogue around that. Dialogue, Korey and Michael, that us three have had in previous podcasts, and then obviously the last month when Tyler jumped on with us as well. It seems like a question that's really reoccurring.
Yeah. You know, can I ask a question for either one of you know, you guys? When you are creating your activities for your athletes, Korey, whether it's for you at Northwestern College there, or Michael, whether it's for you at Building Better Athletes, you know, or Shawn, you know, definitely share as well. Are you starting in one area and then moving the dial, or are you just picking a direction for the day and kind of running it there? Are you deciding based off who you have that day? I know, Michael, yours, mine's the same way. Where you have like a hodgepodge of athletes. How are you guys tackling that? Or is it just kind of I want to expose them to certain things today?
What do you mean by a certain area?
Do you start with less representative and kind of go towards more representative, or are you working backwards? Do you kind of just pick something that you know or you feel is tightly coupled, is going to allow them to you know, pick up information in the environment, or directly pick up that information in the environment with the activities that you're putting out there? Or are you just going, you know, this is what we're doing today. You know, I have this for this group. I'm going to use this one for this group and that group. Or do they change?
I would say I don't really do a ton anymore where there's nothing coupled, right? Where they're just like, you know, shuffling or moving side to side, moving front back, or straight ahead. Like very, very little is not coupled to something. And I'll say the same thing for, I guess, more general stimuli, right? It's still going to be, I mean, I work with our field sports. So most of what we do is in response to another human.
Yeah, that's
almost always
fantastic.
Like
yeah.
even you know, I think I have athletes that kind of come in with a pretty low level ability or understanding of how to control their center of mass and base of support. So I would say, yeah, we definitely start a little bit scaled back. and I have everywhere, like tomorrow morning, I'll have 45 football players. All right. And it'll be our first change of direction, multi-directional agility day of the semester. And so I've got, guys who are on 4th year on campus all the way to they've been here for 6 months. So we start a little scaled back, but very little of what we do, almost none of what we do is on air or not coupled to some type of information. Okay. And I again, like my first foray into this day would be, you're going to run to maybe, I thought I was getting real crazy by having like maybe 3 different colored cones out there, and they're all 3 different colors. And I'm saying, when I yell a certain color, you're running to that cone and then getting back to where you started as fast as possible. And that's about as complex as we would get. Whereas now, we're basically going to be doing some low level mirroring in the warm up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic.
So my warm up is now really what my session used to be. And maybe not even that. Like, we probably wouldn't have gotten to mirroring till maybe halfway through. Like right now we get 7 weeks. We might not have gotten to mirroring until week 4. And everything leading up to that was either decoupled and basically cone drills. So then every week it's adding in some form of complexity, something else for them to, some more information or something, adding to the tasks that they're required to do. So where we might start with just a pretty basic mirror drill with maybe something like a run out at the end to quote unquote finish the activity. Then next week we're going to add something else to that and layer it on top. Maybe that's more people involved. Maybe we're going to, like what Michael does really, something I stole from him is, you're going to maybe have to look through a few people to stay with whoever your partner is in like a mirroring activity. And then the following week, maybe open it up even more to where we're now working really with more spaces, not in between 2 defined points. And we might add in more people. We might add in some type of obstruction or obstacle to kind of deal with. That's kind of like where I've really migrated towards over the past year, really. I think about how really short amount of time I've been doing this stuff, but it hasn't been very long. So like, we're talking like this, I'm now going into year 2 of really starting to implement this stuff. But I think it's all been great changes. So that's kind of my process.
I love it. I appreciate that. And the music to my ears personally was the what my sessions started with, or what my sessions start with now, is what they used to, be in the middle or to the end.
Yeah, right. So true.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
But the athletes appreciate it too. And we've talked about this, right? The athletes appreciate it too, because it immediately feels more like the sport to them right away, right? It immediately feels more like the sport to them. And they're like, all right, this is awesome. We're definitely working on things that I know I've got to do. For football, they're going to do this. They're back to football in 9 weeks because of spring practice. So we get 7 weeks of training, spring break, and then they're back at it. So as a coach, knowing that at my level, I don't really see them in the summer, like, we have to use this time as efficiently as possible and get as much done as we can. And I guess I've just kind of made the choice that we're going to start maybe at where in the past, that was the middle of where we started. We're going to kind of put that more at the beginning now. But what's interesting about what you are talking about with your session is you started somewhat complex, and you actually decreased in complexity. Was that based off of how that first activity went?
No, it was simply Shawn and I just wanted people to share, quite frankly. We wanted it to be all of us were there contributing, and I wanted to learn from them. And Shawn was the same way. There's a lot of bright people out there that even if they don't understand why or what they're doing, you're like, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. Or maybe they have a deep understanding of it, and you can learn from them that way. But I think we're all in the boat of learning from anybody, and you can always absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and make what is uniquely your own. And I probably butchered that, but I still used to get an idea of what it is from Bruce Lee. So no, we didn't start in a specific way. It was more we wanted people to share, and the first person who went straight to a relatively representative activity. And then I believe the next one was the same way. And then we kind of went back into what do you use if you're working with several sports. So no, that wasn't the direction and the intention there.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know if that was what happened, because I didn't know if you were trying to get at maybe like the non-linearity of learning and how that
good point.
Like how we like our progressions in strength and conditioning, and we know that people just don't learn at the same paces. They don't develop skill at the same paces. And so I didn't know if it was something related to that, where you maybe started with something and then with whoever was a part of it had to somewhat choose more of a common term, regress, right? That's kind of a term most people would be familiar with, based off of what you saw.
Yeah, no, that wasn't the initial reason behind it, but to your point, and it could honestly probably take, with all of our abilities to share there, another hour or longer to go over kind of the nonlinear manner of that. But you can certainly, I know for me personally, in my understanding of these theories and these methodologies, I used to think I needed to, and I wasn't really even thinking progression per se. I was more thinking I move from more novel movement to it has to be have that specifying information so they can coordinate and control their actions. And then I realized, well, I need to have that creativity and that adaptability within play here. And so, I will personally go back and forth a little bit, and that's a very short answer of it. But no, it's not just a here and this is direction it goes. That's just the whole nature of nonlinear pedagogy to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Michael, I didn't mean to kind of cut you off from your answer to Tyler's question there, but I'm interested also to kind of hear how you handle it, because at least for me, I have everyone from the same sport. Tomorrow's all football. This morning was all soccer. Tomorrow morning will be soccer. Women's soccer, and at least everyone's the same sport. And I think, Michael, you do a great job of handling multiple different sports in multiple different ages. So I guess how have you been going about that? And has anything kind of changed with you recently, or anything you've been trying?
No, just continuing the same path. So for our movement days, I put together some sort of general plan. I do think most sports have a lot of similarities between them, at least field team sports. Kind of some of the affordances would be the same: create space, close space. There's a lot of similarities between the sports. So I put up like a general plan for the day. Now, I have my own biases. I tend to look at football and basketball more closely than maybe soccer, lacrosse, and whatnot. So a lot of my movement sessions tend to be probably more a bias towards more representative towards those sports. So I kind of have that mindset, and I'm sure my interns could tell you this, but they probably drives them nuts. I kind of read the feel of my session. So if I have 10 athletes and like 8 are basketball players, I will definitely change and modify what I have written down for our movement session on the board to be a little bit more specifying towards those basketball athletes. And just today, we had a track athlete in, and she was doing some multi-directional or environment that
Fantastic.
we're doing. And she looked a little bit like a fish out of water, but that's going to happen every once in a while. So as long as I think if you're using kind of human beings and building, environments and scenarios that have some representation towards if you're doing like just say football. So a lot of times I like to study receivers and running backs, or I tend to be more offensive minded and build scenarios for those type of positions. Even if you're a point guard or a soccer player or a lacrosse player, there's a lot of similarities between those things that I think I don't think you're doing a disservice in that sense. Yeah. So as long as the coaches, I believe, if they are kind of hopefully studying the problems of the sport or trying to have some empathy for, looking at the sport from not the bird's eye view, but the actual athlete's view, see some of the problems from their standpoint, I think you're doing a service. And the last thing I'll do with a lot of my older athletes is I'll let they control really the session. So I give them homework, and you guys are now in control. Say 3 athletes, a lot of times we do our field sessions. You guys are now in charge of building the environment and the task or the activity that we're going to do for the day. So I give a lot of ownership on those guys to, hey, this is usually after a couple of weeks of me building scenarios and doing some activities. And then I tell those guys, you guys study your weaknesses or some of the demands of your position within your sport. And you guys are now in charge of running our movement session. And I'm just going to kind of facilitate, but it's your guys' job and act to now have some ownership of understanding what are the problems to your position and what are your weaknesses in terms of solving those problems, and now come up with some sort of environment that or task that allows you to kind of be exposed to those problems. And so those are now not doing that with like my middle school turds. Those are all for my older athletes and whatnot. But I do just a general movement for the day. It's based off of probably me. Like tonight, I'll go to a basketball game after this, and I'll see something, and I'll probably do that tomorrow in my movement session. Even though I may not have all basketball games tomorrow, I kind of like to expose some of those situations. And then also for me, I mean, I think reading the literature and the research has done a ton for me. Just like including a ball, like is incredible. Like I just read some research. This was about 2 months ago. A lot of ACL injuries happen when a person is catching a ball. And so they're taking their kind of their focus is on like an implement flying through the air, and they're not really paying attention to what their body's doing in space because they're kind of on a dual task, or they're passing, or so just including a ball. That idea came from just kind of reading the research on ACL injuries, and a lot of the injuries, non-contact injuries, are actually from them having some sort of dual task where they have a ball, they're passing or catching or dribbling the ball, so their attention is kind of distracted from maybe their movements. Running with a turned torso or attention somewhere else. Same thing. Another research thing I talked about, some GPS tracking of soccer players, and same things like running back with the ball. They're looking back at defenders. So, you see some of the disconnect between just purely linear speed. You have to be fast with a turned torso and your eyes and your attention attuned to somebody else, but still have to carry linear mechanics. So long-winded answer there, but all these different things I try to just put together in some sort of general thing that I think would help most field team sport athletes. And then depending on my read of the session and my athletes I have in that session, I'll maybe drift one way or the other. Like I said, my interns are like, well, you did this on session, the first session, this the second session, this the third session. I don't know what the hell you're doing, but that's kind of how I do it. I kind of honestly fly by the seat of my pants sometimes, just reading the room and then making adjustments. So I don't have a good answer for that. I know people are always asking, like, how'd you come up with this drill or this, all your drills? It's like,
watch the sport.
Yeah, it's a collaboration between me and the athlete, and reading the room and having some sort of, social awareness and understanding of maybe what's appropriate or where to go. And I think the biggest thing would be get your athletes involved. I mean, a lot of some of the progressions that I've had is like, hey, athletes are like, hey, let's try this. Can we do this? Like, hell yeah, let's do it. And so those would be my 2 cents on how I construct, despite having a vast number of different athletes. And unfortunately, like I said today, we have a track athlete that probably, moving in the frontal plane and the transverse plane is definitely good for a sprinter to be exposed to that because they never are. And maybe a swimmer that's, just a fish, just a water-based creature, to be exposed to some of these things. They're probably like, this is dumb. I don't do this in my sport. Yes, that happens. I mean, I'm not going to lie that a swimmer would be like, why am I doing this? Or a sprinter, like, why am I have to do this? I'm a sprinter. But that happens. So that's just comes with the territory, I guess. But we try to connect it to them if we, as best we can.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Michael, I definitely want to add there, Michael, I love the fact that you give that type of autonomy and that type of ownership. Yep. I started doing that a number of years back, and the things that your athletes come up with, the things that they create, will tell you so much about sort of where they feel their deficiencies or dysfunctions are, and they'll be able to come up with certain things or scenarios that will likely help guide not only themselves but other athletes as well. For like, there's things that my athletes come up with that I still then use for other athletes that may have those respective gaps as well. So kudos to you for placing such a high priority on that, because I think that's something that everyone can do, that we just don't do enough of. We all want to be control freaks, as we've talked about numerous times on this podcast before, but I would say probably a quarter to 30, maybe, a third of % of the activities that I lay out in my learning environments are probably designed by my athletes as well, just simply for that same reasons, or those same reasons that you talked about, Michael. So
yeah.
I love it.
And from a coaching standpoint, I don't know if this is something that people are wary about. I don't think you have to start like right away. Hey, build a environment, build an activity for this. Like just start with, hey, what leg forward do you want in your stance this time? Hey, move the boundaries around to wherever you want. What do you guys want to, what are we going to actually initiate the movement on? You guys, so just can you start really, really small? I think in Rob Gray's, podcast, he talked about some of that autonomy from athletes, and as simple as like letting the athletes choose which ball to use goes a really long ways. Like just what color ball do you want to use today? All right. Do you want to use it? Just those small things I think go a long ways in actually having the athletes feel that their opinion is valued. So it's not like you got to, like what we just said, just like, hey, you guys are in control, construct the whole movement today. It's like, hey, how far are we going to go in this movement? Are we going to go 5 yards or 10 yards? You guys choose, whatever it may be. It's just those small things, I think, allow the athletes some ownership. And then also I think just their engagement increases. So that's easy ways that I've started to start small. Yeah. There's, I feel trustful, or we build trust, and then, they just grow from there.
Yeah. Well, and I think a key word that you said in there a few minutes ago, was the word partners or partnership. And I think if we all viewed movement skill acquisition for each one of our respective athletes or our populations of them as a partnership, as opposed to some level of dictatorship, we would start to probably get a lot further in regards to where their movement skill set should go, or where it should flow, and what it should eventually be able to emerge with.
Yeah. And just, it's hard, I have some athletes come back and, a football player, and he's a quarterback. And I just remember one time he, a really, really sharp kid, a very nuanced in his thought process. And, he came back to the sideline and he, gave a suggestion to the offensive coordinator, and the guy's like, shut the fuck up. You're the player. I'm the coach. And it's just like, is that really like where, and I'm sure all of us as athletes have probably felt that from a coaching, like, hey, I'm the coach, you're the player, know your lane, right? I don't know. To me, sometimes I think as coaches, you just, get rid of your ego a little bit and have some, it's just hard for me to understand that the lack of information that you could be garnering from your athletes, because they do have a lot of crap ideas, but there are some, your job as a coach to sift through the crap and find the gold in those opinions or their offerings. So that's what I've come to the last 3-4 years.
Well, and I do also want to give a little bit of shout out there to Korey as well, because basically what you described in your answer, at least to me, basically described that right when you first started, you were very cue or stimulus based. And now, even though you might not use the exact terms or verbiage, it seems to me, because of the level or layers of complexity that you've begun to add in most of your sessions and most of the problems that you have within your learning environment, is you're very information based. And you're requiring more problem solving, and you're requiring more affordances to just naturally emerge and appear and disappear for your athletes, and for them to be able to connect with it. So I think I would be amiss if I didn't trace back to 10-15 minutes ago when you gave your answer, because that's really what I saw or heard as you were speaking there in regards to some of the things that you've done, or the evolution of your own craft as well.
I think one of my favorite reasons for doing podcasts is learning while I'm on them. And so I can't thank you guys enough for, giving me the opportunity to be a part of it too, just because, you sit here and I don't think I've said anything for about 15 minutes. And I've learned for 15 minutes. So I appreciate it, guys. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Given what we've kind of discussed so far, we got about 20 minutes here before we all got to pop off, but anything, from the previous discussions that you think we could tail into that, would gain us further discussion?
I guess my main curiosity is specifically around the fact, if, even though we went and tackled the whole idea of information versus cues versus stimuli, or the ideas of direct perception versus indirect perception, and perception, intention, and action coupling, or information movement coupling, what questions in particular, because I remember just even an hour ago, Korey, where you made the mention of something we would just a little bit more clarity in regards to what those ideas mean. Do you feel as though we were able to at least take steps forward, positive steps forward, into sort of peeling back the layers on the distinctions or the differences between those sort of bodies or pockets of knowledge?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe if we wanted to somewhat return to that, because this is something that is still popping into my head when you, as specific, well, especially you and Tyler were talking with like the whole stimulus versus information versus cue. Now, cue, that in my head, when I think cue, and this is kind of the issue with cues, right? It's what is interpreted by the person hearing the cue and the effectiveness of that cue. When I think cue, I think this is something I'm going to say to somebody outside of when they're actually performing to elicit some type of biomechanical or motor behavior change.
I'm glad that you actually said that, because it actually brings me back to our very first movement meetup. And Tyler, you probably remember this, where we were talking about problems within the environment or within the task. And all of a sudden, Tyler actually stopped the conversation. He said, wait a minute, I think we might actually be talking about two different things. And I think right now, it actually, I'm glad that we sort of retabled this idea or this discussion, because in an information processing or a motor behavior standpoint, when we were talking cues earlier, we were essentially talking cues within the task or the problem. Now, they certainly could be augmented instructional cues. They certainly could be augmented information. But I'm glad that you actually brought that up, because earlier when we were talking about it, I never actually put that connotation to it.
I get where stimulus information are literally like they can kind of be compared directly, and then with cue, I'm like, wait, all right, but I'm not like yelling cues at, well, some people do, yelling cues at someone as they're doing something, an activity, and really expecting an in the moment change. Whereas I'm thinking cue, like your classical, like let's put an image in their head, or let's try to divert focus internally to externally. Like, I think a lot of people, when they hear cue, that's what they think of. And so when I was hearing you guys at our movement meetup and the one in at Lifetime, and you guys were talking about cue versus stimulus versus information, that's where I was a little bit like, okay, what am I missing here? I'm thinking cue is like what you say to somebody.
No, I'll jump in and say there, and I'll apologize ahead of time. My battery just popped up, only 20% left in my phone, so that's a good thing. That means we've been learning for a while. For me personally, bringing up the difference, the cue in the environment, that's going to be related to indirect perception. I've got to recall something from memory. There's that, to me, it's not that learning online. Okay, that coupling, that direct perception of information in the environment that allows us to interact directly with it, versus needing to have that, now I'm ready. Now I can respond. And Rob's even used the example of that processing of the camera on an iPhone and kind of pixelating and making the picture crisper and clearer. And so that's different for me. When I'm in the weight room, now I have gotten away from utilizing a cue to have an athlete do something different than what they may be doing. I will allow more exploration in what they are doing, as long as there's not a high potential for injury that is going to potentially occur. But let's say I'm wanting someone to hinge. I might tell them, I want you to imagine like you're reaching your hips back and touching a button on the wall. So for me, it's like, you're not saying, hey, I want you to bend over and flex your hips. I'm wanting you to reach back. It's interacting with something in the environment. And so that cue there, or I want you to, if they were jumping, I want you to explode the ground away. But I will tell you that in my experiences, in a non-linear based fashion, or in a non-weight room and in even sometimes personal training based fashion, I know that information can be very powerful. But in athletes on field, it just doesn't live there for me. And so I think that's probably the extent I'll go there with that right now, just because I think that could be talked about for an entire podcast. But I still use cueing in a weight room to help them interact with the floor, interact with the bar, interact with the kettlebell, interact with the medicine ball, but as far as in a multidimensional, complex, chaotic type environment where there's layers upon layers of information and intentions are changing, it just doesn't live there for me.
All right. So I guess the stimuli versus information is something that I know I'll have to go think deeply about, because it is something that, currently I'm not quite fully understanding the difference for me. When I think of stimuli, I do think of like a stimuli providing information. And I think of direct information. So that's where I'm struggling with. Like, so when you talk about information within an environment, specific, that could be anything from how an athlete's moving, their body positions, how they're dropping their hips or their speeds, right? And that, to me, that all goes to, at least connects in my brain, that's a stimulus. And that stimulus then provides an affordance. It's an opportunity for action based on the stimulus. So I'm struggling right now just, with the information versus stimulus, because I see them as one and the same. And I know you guys laid it out very, clearly. I just have to kind of meditate over that because I'm struggling with that. That concept for me. I'm just not seeing, when you guys say information, I'm thinking about, information within an environment. And to me, the word keeps coming back to me as stimulus. That's still a stimuli that's giving off information. And I have to, that's affording me opportunities for action. So I'm struggling with that concept. I know we just basically brought it up earlier today as a potential thing to talk about. So something that I have not quite wrapped my head around. And I don't know if you guys are clear where I'm coming from. So you talked about, like earlier, you talked about a receiver or D-back breaking on a deep comeback route, right? Information that they're trying to attune themselves to, provides affordances, right? What is that information? Are you talking about, from a D-back's perspective, what information are you trying to direct their attention to?
Well, it could certainly be for an offensive guy or a defensive guy. In that particular scenario, I was using it as an example based off of one of the receivers. I work with a couple, but one of the receivers that I have been working with, and through film study and through watching him play in person, I would see, and this is also through conversations I've had with him, I would see him off of a comeback often try to exploit the sideline where, without me jumping to conclusions, I'm kind of like, why is he not using that space that's open in the middle of the field? And so after asking questions like, what did you hear? What were you seeing? It was more for me, he said, I'm just going to use what I've used, which is my body, and I'm going to try to pick up a couple yards and I'm going to, get out of bounds, And so for me, I was wanting him to exploit that space or potentially interact with that space. So the information is what he is perceiving, what he's hearing, the footsteps, the vibrations, the sound. It's the direction of what's in front of him as he has offensive and defensive guys that are pursuing him as he just caught the ball. I view that as information, because to me, stimulus means sparking something, sparking the need to go find it versus it being right there available for you. And I can't give you as much depth, I guess, on any more than that, because that's just kind of how I view it. And I need to clearly think even more deeply about it. But for me, it's more the direct versus indirect. It's more the I need to recall versus I don't need to recall. I don't have any processing that needs to happen because that information is right there based off of the, and I don't want to get into this too much because it's an area that I need to continue to study. But Gibson's work on optical array and optic flow and how light bounces off of textures and contours and how that information is there in the environment living versus it being I start at the retina and then I go outward. I'm going to start in the environment and see what it provides for me. And Rob talks about that some on his podcast on his recap on J.J. Gibson. I believe it's number 1. I don't remember. It's been a while since I've listened to it, but that's kind of how I see it. And so in that particular scenario, it was more trying to get him to have different types of constraints there for him to interact with those constraints and actualize those affordances.
Yeah, I mean, I see space as a stimuli. I don't know, this maybe it's just my brain, but I sometimes see space as a stimuli. And I guess you guys talked about, a stimuli involves with some sort of processing. It involves the athlete having to stop for a second, process, react to that, while information is just kind of interacting. And that's, I guess, like interacting to me involves some sort of processing in that regard. But I see space as a stimuli, just as you guys talk about space's importance. I guess it's just my brain not,
Sure.
I have to deeply study this a lot more. But to me, it's just hard for me right now to differentiate between the two. And that's my struggle.
Well, and to me, what you're describing there, Michael, is you're saying stimuli, but you actually are describing information in the way that it's, or affordances, especially as you talked or used the space example there.
That's what I was
the way
going
that it's typically talked about in some of the ecological dynamics framework of looking at it. That information is a way for us to connect with our perceptual degrees of freedom, as opposed to a stimuli. To me, often, again, insinuates, and maybe this is just the connotation that I build in my brain when I hear stimuli, is that if this, then that rule. And affordances and information aren't like that at all. That there's affordances everywhere within our landscape, whether they're task affordances or environmental affordances, and how they're coalescing and interacting, that space to one person could mean a space to go exploit and manipulate and search a little bit more. And to another person, maybe it's a power running back and they want to go find human bodies, as opposed to, like a Saquon Barkley versus, a Marshawn Lynch. They're going to go find a similar behaving problem, but they're not going to interact with it in the same way because they have different perceptions and intentions of what it means. And so then, to me, it's not really a stimuli, because the stimuli would say, like, ding, 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 here, this is going off. I now have to act in this way, as opposed to, here's this affordance. I'm going to interact with it. I could choose to accept this. I could choose to decline it, and I could go over here for this other affordance. As opposed to, to me, information and affordance is just more multidimensional, and it has more depth and more richness to it, as opposed to the stimuli. It's just kind of like ding, light, go, act.
Yeah, but I guess that's where so a stimuli, you guys, is that there's one response to a stimuli, one correct response. There's a stimuli. This is the only correct way to respond to it, while an affordance or information allows for a little bit of creativity, a little bit of exploration to that information, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's definitely, that helps, because, again, for me.
It'll allow that perceptual degrees of freedom.
Yep. It's kind of like, it's very similar, No, I mean, I just, like, as you were saying that to me would be like, you're cooking something and you touch a hot object. Remove your hand. Meaning, for that to me is a stimulus, versus it being that when you describe space, I can exploit that space with a soccer ball. I can exploit that space by moving through that space. That space is information, which contains those affordances, which I can choose, like Shawn was alluding to interact with or not. Do I bounce it to the sideline whenever I could have exploited the space in the middle of the field, but I chose not to? Why did I not choose to exploit that space? That gets into shared affordances a little bit.
And where the confusion probably seems to be lying, Michael, goes back to a question that you had about an hour ago in regards to, is a stimulus information? And it's certainly, we still have to connect to sensory information to gain access or detection of that stimulus, or of that cue. We still have to connect to information, but it's just we're connecting in a different way with maybe different perceptual, intentional or cognitions, and then, of course, processes to act. It's just the way that, to me, the way that we would organize the degrees of freedom at each one of those dimensional subsystem levels of the human movement system. Again, perceptual or cognition or action, as opposed to, there's an idealized pattern that has to be formulated in regards to the response to the stimulus.
Well, perfect, guys. I know we're running out of time here. I guess we can try something different here. But, I mean, I know shared affordances versus like a team knowledge model would be something we could discuss in the future. I know something that I've been looking into lately is kind of the team knowledge or team cognition model versus a shared affordance ecological model. And if there are any listeners, I don't even know, there are listeners that have stayed on this long, feel free to please, email me or anybody of these guys here in the list, or social media is a good way to access any of us. Direct message us, tweet at us, and be open. Any other topics that you guys would see us would like to see discussed around. I know, like we said, we kind of go into these things kind of open and just see where it kind of organically goes. But we'd love to see more questions specifically from anybody that does listen to these things that maybe we haven't talked about yet. But I know we've talked in the past that tackling differential learning, shared affordances versus team cognition are two things that we'd like to dive into a little bit more. Or anything else like that. So listeners, you got some job for us, please. But yeah, anything else, you guys? The last thing we got just a few minutes. This might go a little longer. So if anybody's got pop off, feel free. But I feel like if you guys have thought any more deeply about our concluding question from our last session about maybe some differences, any other differences you guys thought from our standpoint, just us four, or your upcoming movement conference, Shawn, in May, what do we foresee as maybe some of the big roadblocks of disagreements or variances in our opinions or our practical application between maybe those of more of an ecological standpoint and those more of a perfect practice schema standpoint? What do you guys foresee main differences? And that could be a long discussion. Or if you guys thought more deeply about us four, anything that you come to your mind?
Yeah, I'll throw one out there. But I'll say that probably that second topic that you brought up there should be a podcast in and of itself, because
yes, absolutely.
I think as we prepare to sort of have that cohesion and convergence, there's so many layers of the difficulties or the challenges that even I've personally come across. I know Tyler has sort of heard me vent about some of those as well, and I think as we sort of lay the primer or start the primer of that fire, that we all have a really rich responsibility, I think, in May, that I think we're going to have to really connect with and really kind of unite on a shared passion with those individuals from the other side of the fence, if you will, or the other side of the bridge. Michael, to answer your first question, I did happen to see an Instagram post last night from you that someone shared with me at the movement meetup, and it looked like you had something that appeared to be awfully close to an agility ladder on the ground, having kids go in and out and over and around, and I lost what little hair I have left as I watched it. So to talk about the differences between us, I had to make sure I at least jobbed you a little bit here today.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we pull it out from time to time. I'm sure those kids were about 8 years old, sort of opposite course. So yeah, I pull that out for them every once in a while. But once a month is probably my standard. And then those guys are definitely not any kind of specific athletes. They're like 6 to 8 year olds. So yeah, we still pull it out for fun and engagement. And within the total global context, it's like 0.15% of what we totally do. So you might see a ladder every once in a while with our youth guys going through obstacle courses or doing stuff like that. Absolutely.
That's great. That's great, Michael. I appreciate it too. And the biggest part about it is obviously being friends and knowing one another. The ownership of it too it was the best part, So no, I just happened to click on it and I'm like, what do we have going on here? Yeah. And John's like, what do you mean? I was like, he looked at it. He kind of looked at me. It was fantastic.
Here's my excuse. Hey kids, what do you want to do? Let's get up the ladder. All right, here you go.
Here we go.
Or that autonomy ownership. They brought it up.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, we pull it out for those guys every once in a while. So
I know way too many pro trainers who say the exact same thing as you do, and at least they use it. At least you only use it for 0.15% or whatever you said, in regards to your overall scale or scope of your program. Because otherwise we'd have a few more issues, I think, on these conversations.
Yeah, I don't think you'll see me use it for anybody over 10 and then under 50. So our adults and our little turds, those guys will use it. Everyone else, I tell them, no, too bad.
We'll let you get away with the validation and the justification of it today.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Korey, anything from you?
Go ahead, Michael.
Anything from you, Korey?
No, I just think to answer your second question quickly, I think we kind of demonstrated some of the hurdles that are faced just with like getting on the same page with terminology. I mean, and you guys heard at the movement meetup last night. What do you mean by affordance? Like, what are affordances? What's the difference between when you guys say stimulus versus information, and like those, I think, are some pretty big hurdles that, quite frankly, a lot of people just have never even flat out heard the terms before. I know, like, before 3 years ago, I had never heard any of that stuff. So until I think sometimes those are like, all right, here we need to lay out, what maybe a different way of thinking is, and the fact that there's a lot of literature out there on this, not just something that we're kind of like trying to be different on. There is literature out there on this stuff.
Decades of it.
A lot of people don't know that it even exists. So I just think, one term, just getting on the same page from a terminology standpoint, but then like a true explanation, kind of where each side is coming from, of like that's non like threatening. No one's gonna start getting upset and mad when you explain your viewpoint. We're just trying to present the viewpoint, because I do think there is a lot of people might get a little frustrated, but they don't really understand the viewpoint. Okay, so I think that can be a hurdle with regards to both sides coming together.
Yeah, and something that just popped into my head is a topic that I didn't think that we probably even discussed as much as I was anticipating that we would today. And simply that was one that we had talked about a number of weeks back. So maybe the next time that we get on and chat, we may want to talk a little bit more about what we really mean in an ecological approach when we say the words perception, intention, and action coupling, or when we do say information movement coupling, just even peeling back the layers on that and those distinctions, or even the idea, Korey, of what you're mentioning there in regards to like self-organization and attunement and affordances. Tyler and I and all four of us seem to probably throw it around almost loosely to a certain degree, because we speak the same language in that regards, but it does create a barrier. That may be a really useful conversation for us to jump on the line the next time that we do, and kind of peel back the layers on a little bit as well, because I think it is a major roadblock, but I think it's one that we all have to kind of tackle collectively as well.
No doubt.
Absolutely. I look forward to that too, just because I know that's going to be very valuable for all four of us, and then all the listeners as well.
Well, perfect, guys. Tyler, I know you got to go pick up your son. You don't want to pick your wife off. You can't be late. So
this is true. He's looking forward to playing trucks. So and as am I. Nice.
Perfect. Well, guys, I know it won't be too long until we hop on again, but thank you guys again. I really appreciate you guys. Honestly, every time you go on this, making me feel like the dumbest person here. And now going home the rest of the night, having to think deeply about a lot of the things we just talked about. So appreciate you guys pushing myself to a new boundary, new limit. I honestly, truly, really appreciate that. But until next time, for Volume 5 of our movement discussion,
yes,
you folks out there can have to patiently wait.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. Thank you guys very much.
Yeah, thanks, fellas. Have a good night.
You guys as well. Likewise.